underlying meaning and purpose of Pesach, namely to leave our own personal Egypt, our own personal limitations. The practical way that this is done, especially on the night of Pesach, namely the retelling of the story of the Exodus during the Seder, using the Haggadah, as well as the eating of Matzah. When it comes to holidays, biblical festivals, there are two components to every single festival. The first component is that which makes it a festival. The fact that it's going to be a day of rest, like Shabbat, the fact that it's going to be a celebratory day, that component is going to be the same for every single festival, no matter what particular festival it is. Whether it's Passover, for example, or Rosh Hashanah, we're going to refrain from work. We're going to have kiddush and special meals. We're going to have a Torah reading service. That's what makes it a festival. In addition to that, there is a second component that makes a particular festival that particular festival as opposed to any other. So again, with the example of Passover and Rosh Hashanah, on Rosh Hashanah we're going to hear the sounding of the shofar. On Passover we're going to retell the Exodus and eat matzah. And every single festival, as far as that second component is concerned, is going to have its own particular mitzvahs. The way that those mitzvahs, that second component, is determined is based on the spiritual theme of the holiday. So when it comes to Rosh Hashanah, for example, it is the anniversary of the creation of the world, the anniversary of when God is master of the universe. In fact, the point of Rosh Hashanah is to coronate God again as master of the universe. And so, to express that unique component of the festival, we are going to sound the shofar like the trumpeters that are lined up on either side of the aisle as the king of flesh and blood comes to his throne and is coronated. When it comes to Pesach, the two mitzvahs, retelling of the Exodus and eating matzah, are going to be the practical expression of the theme of Pesach, namely the festival of our freedom. For example, Pesach enables us to undergo a personal exodus from Egypt by transcending our individual limits. This is exactly what we explained last week when we explored the fact that the Hebrew word for Egypt is basically the same as the Hebrew word for limitations, and therefore, in fact, every single person should and must be able to see himself as if leaving Egypt, because everyone has artificial limitations that they believe to be real but are in fact not real, and we are to transcend them and thus leave our own personal Egypt. Accordingly, God gave us the mitzvah of eating matzah to help us internalize that experience. Now here it says, gave us the mitzvah, singular, but in reality, again, there are two biblical requirements, two mitzvahs, that are the practical expression of what Pesach is all about. Both mitzvahs are required to be done on the night of Pesach, namely, retelling the Exodus and eating matzah. The reason why we mention the singular here, the mitzvah of eating matzah, and we basically seem to ignore the other mitzvah, namely of retelling the Exodus, is not just because this article focuses on matzah. Yes, there are two mitzvahs, but as much as both of them are absolutely integral and required and commandments, there is a significant distinction between the two. Retelling of the Exodus is an intellectual exercise. It involves understanding what happened as far as how we got to Egypt, what happened to us in Egypt, how we left Egypt. Those are going to be intellectual endeavors. They should affect our emotions. They obviously have to be said out loud in order that it should be a practical act, which is the basic functional definition of a commandment. But as much as that is true, eating matzah is so much more corporeal and so much more physical and practical that if one has to choose one bottom line mitzvah that expresses the basic spiritual theme of the holiday, it's going to be eating matzah. For our food is assimilated into our bodies, becoming part of our flesh and blood. Eating matzah thus converts the experience of self-transcendence into an integral part of our beings. The significance of matzah may be understood by comparing it to chametz, or leaven. The reason why we can make this comparison is twofold. First and foremost, on a very basic and simple level, the foundation of a sustaining diet, of our dietary sustenance, is bread. In fact, according to halacha, according to Jewish law, if you eat bread, you have had a meal. If you do not eat bread, regardless of how much other things you might be eating, you have not had a meal. The basis of a meal is bread. Obviously, bread is prohibited on Pesach, but what replaces it is matzah. So matzah becomes the basis of the meal. Because one replaces the other, and they function in the same way to serve the same purpose, the basis of a meal, obviously there is a justified comparison between the two. Furthermore, the Talmud tells us that the only grains from which one can make flour and then make matzah are the same grains that when one makes flour and mixes them with water would make leaven. So for example, wheat and barley and spelt and oats and rye, you take those grains, you make flour and you add water, you can make matzah. Because those are the 5 grains that make for bread. If, let's say, one takes soy flour or corn flour, as much as one could maybe make something similar to bread, it's not really bread. And therefore, if one makes matzah out of those flours, it's not really matzah. You'll see sometimes in stores matzah that is made from potato starch. It's kosher for Passover 100%. But it's not matzah because potatoes aren't one of the 5 grains. So really, when we boil it down to the bottom line, both leaven and matzah come from exactly the same stuff, the 5 grains. Flour made from those 5 grains and only from those 5 grains, when treated one way, it becomes leaven. When treated another way, it becomes matzah. As we'll read in a second, the analogy, of course, is being humble or being haughty. But that comes from the very same stuff. A person can be successful and intelligent and talented and see those qualities and those accomplishments as my hand has gotten me this success. That's leaven. That's chametz. The very same person with the very same successes and the very same talents sees those positive traits as gifts from God, those that have helped me along the line and have taught me or guided me. And all of a sudden, from the very same stuff comes a humble person, just like matzah. Chametz, which becomes bloated as it rises, symbolizes self-inflated egotism and pride. Matzah, which remains flat and unpretentious, reflects selfless humility. This concept is also reflected in the Torah's description of matzah as poor man's bread. Sometimes it's also rendered as bread of affliction. A poor man is humble and free of arrogance. Again, when one is afflicted, one is usually not terribly arrogant or haughty about that situation. Eating poor man's bread reduces our selfish tendencies. You are what you eat. This finds expression in halacha, in Jewish law. There is no question of chametz. In other words, it's certainly not chametz according to all opinions in matzah ashira, literally rich matzah, made of flour and liquids other than water, for example, egg matzah. Or let's say one were to take, let's say, flour of wheat, and instead of mixing it with water, he mixes it with wine, or in this case, egg yolk. It's very clear per Talmudic law that this is not chametz whatsoever. It's perfectly kosher for Passover. Nevertheless, it cannot be used to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah. Why not? It's made from the 5 grains. We said that you can make matzah only from those 5 grains that make bread. This is that scenario. I've made it from, let's say, wheat flour. It's perfectly kosher for Passover. Why am I not able to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah with rich matzah? Since it is not poor man's bread, it fails to convey the same spiritual message as simple matzah. In other words, it is humble enough to be kosher for Passover, but it is not humble enough to actually fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on Passover. One can eat rich matzah even on the night of the Seder, as long as one is not using it to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on the night of the Seder, because it's not poor man's bread. It's not humble enough. Another basic difference between chametz, leaven, and matzah can be perceived by comparing the letters which make up these words. The reason why the letters and their shapes are important, according to Jewish mysticism, is because the conduit for God's effluence, for God's energy as it comes into the world and recreates and reanimates every single creation in the world, is actually the letters of the 10 utterances. Let there be light and let there be a firmament, etc. Those letters which form those words are the gateway through which that divine energy comes down. And the shape of the particular letter is the shape of that delivery, of that divine effluence into the world. And so we can tell a lot by the shapes of letters when we compare them. Both words, chametz and matzah, contain the letters tzadik and mem, so those are not a point of comparison, they're similar. They differ only in that matzah is spelled with a hey and chametz with a ches. A hey and a ches are both formed of 3 lines with an opening below. In fact, they're basically the same letter almost entirely. There's a top side, there's a right leg connected for both letters. There's a left leg, but of course the difference between a ches and a hey is that by the ches, that left leg is connected just like the right leg is. With a hey, that left leg is a little shorter, and therefore it is disconnected in the upper left-hand corner. A hey and a ches are both formed of 3 lines with an opening below, which recalls the verse, sin crouches at the opening. In other words, if we open the door, as it were, for the influence of the evil inclination, it's very likely that one will come to sin. The letter ches is closed on all 3 sides, signifying no escape from the sin at the opening. If one imagines, for example, being inside of that ches, there's no escape from that opening, and that opening basically functions as looking down upon anything and everything else. Being inside of that entirely closed ches, one doesn't see anything above him. So everyone is less than him, less intelligent, less pious, less knowledgeable, less anything else. The hey, by contrast, has an additional opening near the top, the upper left-hand corner, as we said. This escape hatch refers to tshuva, the ever-open opportunity for repenting or returning to God. When a person considers himself inside of that hey, there is the perception of, oh wait, there's something above me, a person who might be wiser than me and could therefore guide me to a better choice in any given situation. Of course, there is the influence of God that I always have to consider. Between chametz, leaven, and matzah are interrelated, namely that leaven rises and is with that ches, whereas matzah is flat and is spelled with the hey. The self-inflation symbolized by leaven is one of the fundamental causes of sin. An opinionated person is concerned primarily with his personal desires and places them above all other goals, increasing the possibility that he will sin. Nobody's there to tell me that I'm doing anything wrong, because everybody's less than me, so obviously that's a perfect environment for doing something wrong and not even realizing it. A person in this state will not be easily moved to repentance or return, to tshuva. Instead, he will seek excuses to rationalize his behavior, for love covers all faults, especially self-love, which can blind us to even our most glaring inadequacies. In contrast, a person whose nature reflects the qualities of matzah, being flat or humble, having that opening with the hey, will be more willing to step beyond his personal wants and fulfill God's will. Even if he errs, and no one's perfect, so obviously it's very likely that At one point or another, a person will make a mistake. Even if he errs, he will not try to justify his behavior, but will seek to correct his faults through tshuva. The Zohar associates matzah with a quality of self-transcendence, calling it the bread of faith. The Zohar, in fact, has two different terms for matzah. The matzah of the first night of Passover is called bread of faith. The matzah of the second night of Passover is called bread of healing. The order of these two terms is very important. A person can develop faith based on healing. In other words, a person, let's say, was literally physically unwell, and maybe medicine, doctors have told him there's really nothing we can do. But nevertheless, he experiences a healing. He recognizes that God is involved, that there's a God in the world, that God has provided him with a new lease on life, and therefore he has faith. Faith that is based on healing. It doesn't have to even be such an extreme example. A person who has any kind of needs that at that moment are not being met, in any form of straits, and then all of a sudden he experiences a personal salvation, he didn't have a job and now he got employment, whatever it is, he says, wow, God is involved. God cares about me and has provided for me my needs and my wants. Therefore, I will believe in God. That faith can exist, but such a faith is actually quite limited and quite limiting. Because as soon as the person, for whatever reason, decides that God has not provided what he should have provided, all of a sudden his faith is either mitigated or completely gone. On the other hand, per the order in the Zohar, where the first night's matzah is the bread of faith, where faith is the foundation, then invariably every scenario where I have needs or wants, God will provide. Everything that I will ever have, God has provided. When faith is the foundation, everything else is considered divine healing or salvation or intervention. Faith involves a commitment beyond the scope of our rational faculties. While we are obliged to understand those manifestations of divinity that are within the grasp of our intellectual capacity, there are levels which are obviously beyond our grasp. We've discussed before that there are three categories of commandments. We can divide and analyze commandments in many different ways. We can divide them into do's and don'ts, or into personal commands that are just between me and God versus communal commands that involve someone else. Another way to divide the commandments and thereby analyze them is to divide them into the three categories of judgments, testimonials, and statutes. Judgments are those commandments which are so logical that even if God had never come to command them, they would still be basically required normal behavior in any healthy society. For example, do not murder. I don't want to die. You don't want to die. Do not murder. God comes along and makes them a divine command as well, but seemingly, even if he didn't, it would be wrong to kill or to murder. Testimonials, that second category, are commandments that on their face do not make sense to us, but once God explains them, then they do. The classic example is Shabbat. There is no logical reason that there has to even be a concept of something called a week. There is a logical reason why there should be something called a day. There's nighttime, daytime, and that cycle forms a day. There is a logical reason why there should be a year. The cycle of the seasons makes for a year. But there's no logical reason why there has to be a week. And even if, for whatever reason, society were to establish the concept of a week, there's definitely no reason why it has to be 7 days. And there's definitely no reason why there should be 1 day of rest. There's no reason why there should be a day of rest at all. And there's no reason why that day of rest should be the 7th day. You could ostensibly have a week made of 10 days and every other day is a day of rest. Logically speaking, that's no better or worse than what we have as a week. So on its face, it does not make sense why we should work for 6 days and then rest on the 7th. But once God says, remember, I created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh. Therefore, you should work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. That makes sense. And by virtue of doing that, we testify to the fact that God created the world and in the fact that he created it in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Those are testimonials. Both judgments and testimonials, at the end of the day, make sense. Either because they are patently obvious, like the judgments, or because God explained them, like the testimonials. The third category are called statutes or decrees. These commandments on their face do not make sense, and God did not explain them. So we're left with because God said so. An example of that would be kosher. There is no logical reason why a pig should be not kosher and a cow should be, yes, kosher. It has nothing to do with physical cleanliness. And God never explained it. He just commanded it. And so we're left with because God said so. 2 of the 3 categories are logical. The third one is supra-rational. And there's obviously no way that a limited human intellect can grasp an infinite divine wisdom. That's where faith comes in. Faith is the only means through which we can relate to these levels. In a personal sense, our faith is something which transcends ourselves because it is above us and outside of us. That's the whole reason kind of why it steps in to bridge that gap between our intellect and God's infinite wisdom. It can be very easily that our faith is theoretical and our life, our behavior, isn't always in keeping with that faith. Often, without thinking, we make decisions that run contrary to our faith. Although we believe in an ideal, we ignore that belief in our day-to-day life. Something that I've noticed here and there and kind of irks me is that people who absolutely know and absolutely believe in the coming of Mashiach and await his coming every single day, just like Maimonides says is the obligation of every single Jew, will use the expression for something that they think is basically never going to happen. When Mashiach comes. I'll be waiting here until Mashiach comes. What do you mean? So he's not coming right now? He's not coming today? But that's what you believe. That might be an example of theoretical faith where practically it's not actually what we do. For example, the Talmud relates that a thief may pray to God for success before a burglary. Well, does he believe in God or doesn't he? He's praying to God, so he believes in him, but he is doing something that God prohibits. So how in the world could he be believing in him? Furthermore, the regular person, the average person, doesn't want to be a burglar. It's dangerous. It could get you in a lot of trouble. So if one is a burglar, it's basically because he thinks that God cannot provide him with a decent living in a normal way. So how in the world is a person who doesn't believe in God's power to provide him a living praying to God for success? Oh, and by the way, in something that God prohibits. Although he believes in God, as is evident from his prayer, he prays for success in an act which is directly opposed to God's will. This is theoretical faith, practically not connected to one's behavior. Most of us are not subject to such blatant errors, but each of us can find examples of how our belief in God fails to be realized and integrated in our daily lives. A student of Torah might fully believe that the teachings he is studying are God's word, transcending human understanding. He can tell you all the examples and all the proofs for why the Torah is true and eternal and divine. Nevertheless, when he is actively engaged in his studies, he might find himself treating Torah as merely an intellectual exercise. He might learn a new halacha or a new mitzvah that he didn't know about before or he didn't know the details of before. But nevertheless, he doesn't integrate that into his actual day-to-day life. He says, that's a good idea. By the same token, in a dizzying moment of success, a God-fearing businessman may entertain the thought that it was my strength and the power of my hand that brought me this wealth. Even though this very same businessman, every single time he says benching, he benches, he's going to say, Hazonas ha'olam kuloi, that God is the one who sustains the entirety of the world. Although in theory he surely believes that it is God's blessing that brings wealth, his belief may not affect his daily behavior and feelings. The mitzvah of eating matzah is intended to, in part, to help us overcome this inner dichotomy. Partaking of this food of faith makes us conscious of the need to internalize our faith and enables us to incorporate it into our daily lives. In light of this, we can understand the statement of the sages. Chavokuk, one of the prophets, came and made them, i.e. the entire realm of the Torah and its commandments, dependent on one mitzvah, namely faith. As it is written, a righteous man lives by his faith. Not just has faith, but lives by his faith. If one is genuinely righteous, or if one wants to become genuinely righteous, there cannot be the gap between theoretical faith and practical living. Rather, one has to live by his faith, never to do anything contrary to the tenets of that faith. Rather than consider faith and observance of the commandments as two separate entities, Chavokuk showed that faith must pervade the totality of our service of God. Faith is thus not just one mitzvah, but the force which motivates and inspires the fulfillment of all mitzvahs. Given the importance of the mitzvah of eating matzah, we should make every effort to share its fulfillment with others. In earlier times, rabbis would send matzahs to all the people living in their communities. Today, this practice should be revived by each of us within his own sphere of influence. It doesn't have to be a rabbi, and it doesn't have to be to an entire community. Friends, family, somebody who otherwise might not have matzah or might not have the best kind of matzah. If possible, the matzahs that we send should be round and handmade, and of the kind that are known as shmura matzah, literally guarded matzah, i.e. those which from a very early stage in their preparation have been lovingly guarded against any possibility of leavening. In this way, we will ensure that many more Jews fulfill the mitzvah in the most perfect manner possible. May these efforts lead to the fulfillment of the promise of our sages. In the month of Nisan, the Jews were redeemed, meaning back in the times of Egypt, and in the month of Nisan, they will be redeemed through the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days.